Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It's strange how your life can snap in half without warning, like an old bone that's been cracked too many times in the same spot, just waiting for the final break. One minute, I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a wine glass, thinking about how Ryan always left his socks under the couch. The next, my phone rang and everything dropped my stomach, the glass, the world. The voice on the other end didn't bother with a preamble. It was a nurse, clinical, and rushed, like she was reading off a grocery list. "Your husband has been in a serious accident," she said, and I swear my brain didn't even process the word serious. I just remember the way her voice clipped on accident, as if that single word was supposed to hold the weight of what came next. A mangled car, twisted metal, blood on the asphalt, and the eerie calm of hospital corridors. By the time I reached the ER, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely sign the form to get in. Everything smelled like disinfectant and plastic tubing, and my heartbeat felt louder than the beeping monitors around me. I saw Ryan lying in that bed, still, pale, tubes everywhere, and I swear something inside me cracked. Not just fear, but something colder. Something more hollow. Like I was already mourning something I wasn't supposed to lose. I don't even remember who else showed up first. It all blurred together, Margaret's high-pitched sobs echoing off the walls, Dean pacing like a caged animal, offering coffee I didn't ask for, trying too hard to hold my hand, brushing my back too long when he hugged me. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe the trauma, but something in his eyes felt off. Not just sad or overwhelmed off. Like he wasn't just grieving. Like he was watching. The doctors told us Ryan's injuries were non-fatal but severe. Skull fracture, broken ribs, internal bleeding, a coma. They said he'd pulled through the worst of it, but they couldn't guarantee when or if he'd wake up. I nodded like I understood, but honestly, none of it registered. All I could hear was that word, coma. Like my marriage had just been paused by some twisted god, and nobody told me how to breathe in the meantime. Dean started coming around more than anyone else. At first, it felt kind. Supportive, even. He brought soup. He fixed the broken hinge on the front door. He offered to pick up groceries, to stay with me so I wasn't alone. He sat with me at the hospital when I didn't want to face the long hours of silence by Ryan's side. He said all the right things, in just the right tone. Too right, actually. It wasn't until the third or fourth visit that I realized he never asked about Ryan's progress. Not really. He just asked how I was holding up. How I was sleeping. Whether I'd thought about moving on emotionally, whatever the hell that means when your husband's chest is still rising and falling in a hospital bed. Then came the gift. It was just a small box, wrapped in silver paper, tied with a navy ribbon. Dean handed it to me with a half smile and said, "From all of us. Just something to keep your spirits up." I hesitated for a second, something instinctive knotting up in my gut, but I unwrapped it anyway. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, simple, elegant, probably expensive. I thanked him, trying to be polite, even though I couldn't shake the awkwardness of the gesture. Why would they give me jewelry? I mean, flowers, maybe. A card, sure. But jewelry? It felt intimate, misplaced. Later that night, while tossing the box into the trash, I noticed something stuck beneath the padding. A small folded note, tucked so tightly into the corner I almost missed it. I thought it was maybe the receipt or a store tag. But it wasn't. It was handwritten. Just a few words, scribbled in black ink on thick paper. "I've always loved you. D." I sat there, holding that note like it had teeth. My brain refused to connect the dots at first, like some part of me still wanted to believe it meant something else. Some other D. Some other context. But there was no mistaking the handwriting. I'd seen it on birthday cards and post-its for years. It was Dean's. Clear as day. Slanted letters. Heavy pressure on the loops. I read it again, and my hands started to shake. What the hell did that mean? Had he written it by mistake? Slipped it in the wrong box? Was this some sick joke? Or was it a confession? That was the night I stopped thinking of Dean as Ryan's awkward little brother. and started wondering what the hell kind of secrets this family had been keeping. There are moments you look back on and wonder how the hell you didn't see it earlier, how the signs were there, clear as a siren, flashing in your face, and somehow you still managed to walk straight past them like a fool, pretending the fire wasn't already eating the walls around you. And that's exactly how I felt about Dean, Ryan's younger brother, the golden boy who always got away with too much and never had to carry any of the weight that came with growing up. Long before the accident, there were things I should have noticed, little moments, stray glances, offhand comments that now sit in my memory like landmines I keep stepping on. I remember last Thanksgiving, when we were standing in the kitchen, and I was chopping vegetables while Ryan wrestled with the goddamn turkey. Dean leaned against the counter, beer in hand, eyes glued to me in a way that wasn't brotherly. He made some dumb joke about how lucky Ryan was to have a wife who could cook and look like a model at the same time. I laughed it off, shrugged, tried to play it cool, but even then, I remember the way his eyes lingered, just a fraction too long, just a beat too slow to look away. There was another time, God, I can't believe I brushed it off, when we were at a barbecue with some friends, and Dean stood beside me by the grill while Ryan went to grab more drinks. He leaned in close, too close, and said, "If Ryan ever screws this up, you let me know, all right?" He said it with that half-smile of his, like he was just being playful, but there was something beneath it, something slick and calculated, something that didn't belong between in-laws. I laughed again, because what else was I supposed to do? Start a scene in the middle of a backyard cookout? That was the thing about Dean. He knew just how far to push, just how much to say without crossing that visible line. He played in the shadows, towing the edge, staying just within reach of deniability. And I let him. I let it slide, again and again, because he was Ryan's brother, and it was easier to believe he was just socially awkward or had a weird sense of humor than to face the truth that maybe he wasn't harmless at all. But after the accident, after Ryan was out of the picture, and the house was colder and quieter than it had ever been, Dean started showing up like it was his goddamn job. At first, I welcomed the company, not because I wanted it, but because the silence was eating me alive. I hadn't slept properly in days, and the idea of not talking to anyone made me feel like I was losing my grip on reality. So when he brought over groceries one day unannounced, I told myself it was a kind gesture. When he cooked dinner and stayed to eat with me, I convinced myself it was just family sticking together in a hard time. But deep down, something was already stirring, something heavy and uneasy, curling in my stomach like a warning. He started coming more often. Uninvited. Always with some excuse. He brought soup when I didn't ask. He fixed the cabinet hinge that didn't need fixing. He changed the porch light, even though I told him I had it covered. He started to memorize my schedule, showing up right as I got home, helping me carry things inside before I even set down my keys. He'd hang his coat like he lived there. He'd talk about Ryan like he was already gone. And then came the moment that flipped everything. It was a Tuesday night, rainy, cold, and quiet. I just finished cleaning the dishes when Dean came up behind me. He didn't say anything at first, just hovered too close, and I could feel his breath against my neck. My shoulders tensed, and I moved slightly to the side, trying to create space, pretending to dry a dish I'd already dried. He didn't move back. Instead, he reached for a towel and brushed his hand against my waist. Not an accident, not casual, not something you do to your brother's wife. I froze. My entire body went stiff like it had locked into place, like every cell in me knew something had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And then he said it, low, deliberate, voice smooth as oil. "You don't have to be alone, you know." That's when it hit me like a brick to the chest. This wasn't support. This wasn't family. This wasn't grief bringing people closer. This was something else entirely. And for the first time, I realized I might not just be mourning my husband. I might be standing in the middle of a damn trap, with the people closest to him already circling like vultures. Have you ever had someone get too close, and you didn't notice it until it was way too late? Ever ignored your gut because you didn't want to believe what you were seeing? Because that's exactly what I did. And now I was starting to understand. Dean wasn't just trying to help. He was waiting. Waiting for something to crumble. Or maybe waiting for me to. I kept the note in my bedside drawer for days, hidden beneath a stack of receipts and old prescriptions. But every time I opened that drawer to grab something, lip balm, headphones, a spare pen, it was there, mocking me with its simplicity. Just 7 damned words inked onto thick paper, yet somehow heavier than anything I'd ever carried in my life. I've always loved you. D. It echoed inside my skull like a slow drip, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain, and even harder to rationalize. I told myself maybe it was some cruel mistake, maybe he meant it for someone else, maybe there was some perfectly innocent explanation, but deep down I already knew. I just didn't want to believe it yet. A few days after finding it, I finally worked up the nerve to ask Dean about it. I waited until we were sitting in the kitchen, late afternoon sun pouring through the window like a spotlight, casting long shadows across the counter. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat when I pulled the note from my pocket and slid it across the table. He looked at it, raised his eyebrows slightly, then let out a half-laugh, so calm, so practiced, it made me feel like I'd dreamt the whole thing. "You're imagining things," he said, voice smooth, eyes unreadable, like this was some joke I didn't get. That wasn't for me. Maybe it came with the box by mistake, you know how stores are. Probably some stockroom kid slipped the wrong card into the wrong box. He shrugged, leaned back in the chair, and smiled like it was nothing, like I hadn't just handed him a loaded gun, and he was too polite to admit it was his. The way he said it, the way he dismissed it so easily, made me question my own damn memory. Was I really so desperate for answers that I'd started inventing drama in my own head? Or was he just that good at pretending? What made it worse, what made it 10 times harder to hold on to my anger, was that Margaret started changing, too. It was subtle at first, little things she'd say when we were alone at the hospital or sitting in my living room pretending to be a normal family. She started praising Dean more often, going on about how helpful he was, how reliable he'd been since the accident, how lucky I was to have someone around to take care of things. Then one afternoon, while I was folding laundry, she said something that knocked the air out of me like a punch. "Maybe," she said slowly, as if she'd rehearsed it, "maybe this is God's way of showing you who really belongs in your life." I stood there with a towel in my hands, staring at her like she'd just spoken in tongues. I asked her what the hell that was supposed to mean, but she just smiled softly and shook her head like I was being naive. "I'm just saying," she continued, "sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways. Maybe he's trying to guide you toward peace, toward someone who's meant to take care of you now." I couldn't even speak. I just nodded and turned away, heart pounding in my ears, teeth clenched so tight my jaw ached. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about Dean acting strange. This was bigger, more insidious, like a slow rot spreading through the foundation of everything I thought was solid. It wasn't just him trying to push his way in, it was her holding the door open for him. And still, I kept second-guessing myself. I kept wondering if maybe I was just unraveling from the stress, from the grief, from the unbearable weight of watching Ryan drift in and out of life while everything around me bent and twisted into something I didn't recognize. I'd wake up in the middle of the night gasping for air, unsure if I was grieving my husband or grieving my sanity. Was I paranoid? Was I losing my grip? Was I turning shadows into monsters just because I didn't want to face the loneliness head-on? But then, the final straw arrived quietly, as if delivered by the devil himself, wrapped in ordinary silence. It was just after 10 on a Wednesday night, and I'd fallen asleep on the couch after a long day at the hospital. When I woke up, my phone buzzed with a new message, no name, just a number I didn't recognize. I opened it, thinking it was a hospital update, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a photo of me, asleep, on that same couch, wrapped in a blanket, head resting on a pillow, taken from the angle of the hallway, as if someone had stood inside the doorway and captured me while I was completely unaware. My skin went cold. My hands started trembling. I live alone. No one had keys but me. I looked around the room in a panic, heart racing, suddenly aware of every creak, every flicker of light, every shadow in the corners of the house. I checked the doors, the windows, everything still locked, no signs of entry, no broken latches. But that photo wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been there. Someone had stood in my house while I slept. And whoever it was, they wanted me to know. I didn't plan to tell her. Not at first, not when I was still trying to convince myself that maybe the photo was some kind of sick prank or that I'd simply lost track of who still had keys to the house. I wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, something that didn't involve the rising bile in my throat every time Dean walked into a room or the way his eyes seemed to follow me even when he wasn't speaking. But after that night, the photo, the silence, the air that felt suddenly heavier than it ever had in this house, I snapped. Not in some dramatic, explosive way, but in that quiet, unraveling sort of way that creeps in when your mind is stretched to its edge and your body is just trying to keep up. I called Margaret the next morning. I told her I needed to talk, that it was urgent, and she agreed to come over with her usual clipped politeness, the kind that always made me feel like a teenager confessing a sin to the church elder. I made coffee just to keep my hands busy, just to fill the silence with something other than the sickening echo of my thoughts. When she walked in, perfectly composed in her beige cardigan and modest gold earrings, I almost couldn't believe I was about to spill everything at her feet. Every suspicion, every twisted interaction, every detail I had spent weeks trying to swallow. I didn't ease into it. I told her about the note, about Dean's weird behavior, about the way he brushed against me like it meant something, about the photo that arrived in the middle of the night like a warning shot from someone who had already decided they owned me. I watched her face the entire time, looking for some flicker of shock, of concern, of horror. But there was nothing. Just a pause, a long, uncomfortable pause that hung in the air like a noose, and then she sighed. A slow, measured sigh, like someone hearing about a mild inconvenience, not a damn red flag waving in the middle of a burning field. "Emily," she said finally, and her voice was softer than I expected, almost pitying, almost maternal, but laced with something else, something colder. "You've been through so much. And grief plays strange tricks on us. It makes us see things that aren't there. It makes us vulnerable, emotional, reactive." I stared at her, unable to process the direction she was steering toward, and she kept going, her tone even more unnerving now, like she was reciting a bedtime story she'd practiced 1,000 times. "You need stability right now," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "You need comfort. And sometimes comfort comes in forms we don't expect. I'm not saying anything's happened, but what if this is just God's way of showing you another path?" I blinked, completely stunned. "Another path?" I repeated, the words barely making it past my throat. "Dean," she said plainly, without a hint of hesitation. "What if it's Dean? What if this is fate? You could keep the family together, Emily. You could stay in this home. You wouldn't have to start over alone." I thought she was joking at first, some bizarre form of twisted humor, but her expression was dead serious. There was no smile, no hint of irony. Just this calculated calm that chilled me more than anything Dean had ever done. She actually meant it. She wasn't appalled by Dean's behavior, she was endorsing it. She was rationalizing it, twisting it into some deranged act of loyalty. "He's been by your side," she continued, as if she were making a case in court. "He's taken care of you. He loves this family. And he loves you." The last part hit like a slap to the face, not because it was news to me, but because hearing her say it, acknowledge it, justify it, meant this wasn't just a one-man delusion anymore. This was something bigger, something rooted deep in the rot of this family tree. I couldn't find words. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand she take it back, but all I could do was stare as she reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick white envelope. She slid it across the table like she was handing me a check for groceries, calm and composed, eyes fixed on mine. "I want you to look at this," she said, as if this were just another formality. I opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out the papers inside, an insurance policy, thick and neatly filed, stamped with the family name at the top. My eyes scanned the lines quickly, and then they landed on the detail that made my heart slam against my ribs. "Dean." Dean was listed as the next guardian. Not just power of attorney. Not just a secondary contact. The next guardian. For Ryan's affairs. For the house. For me, by implication. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't paperwork gone wrong. That was a plan carefully crafted, coldly orchestrated, and now laid out in front of me like a contract to my own entrapment. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I realized this was never about grief or comfort or family unity. This was about ownership. And they were trying to make me part of the estate. There's a particular kind of rage that doesn't roar or explode or make you tear down walls in a frenzy. It just simmers, slow and steady, bubbling beneath your skin like poison, infecting everything you see and everything you touch. It's the kind of fury that comes after silence, after disbelief, after the slow erosion of your reality by people you once trusted to hold your damn world together. That's what it felt like after Margaret slid that insurance envelope across the table, like she was offering me a future she'd already decided on my behalf, like my life wasn't mine anymore, but some family heirloom to be passed between brothers. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't cry either. I just lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me, counting the seconds between each creak, waiting for the morning light to give me permission to start my revenge. The first thing I did was buy cameras, discreet, motion-triggered, high-resolution little eyes that I could hide behind bookshelf knickknacks and kitchen plants and inside the hallway light fixtures. I didn't care if it was legal or not. I didn't care if anyone ever found them. I just needed to see. I needed proof, not just for myself, but so I could finally stop feeling like I was losing my damn mind in my own house. I started recording conversations, too, audio backups on my phone, voice memos in my purse, anything I could use to build a timeline of their twisted little plot. And I kept everything: dates, details, every strange phrase Dean said, every moment Margaret pushed her poisonous little gospel about fate and family. Then came the night I heard it, the night everything finally clicked into place like a puzzle I'd been dreading to finish. I was upstairs in my bedroom, pretending to be asleep, and I had the hallway mic set up just outside the guest room where Dean had been staying more often lately. The walls in this house aren't thick, especially when people get careless. I was half asleep when the recording pinged on my phone, triggered by voices in the hallway. I hit play and listened, heart pounding harder with every second. Dean's voice came first, low and frustrated. She's not giving in. She's still cold. Then Margaret's, sharper than I'd ever heard it before, full of that cutting judgment she usually reserved for strangers. You're rushing her. Let her break on her own. Dean hissed something I couldn't catch, but then I heard her again, quieter this time, almost whispering. She'll crack eventually. She's lonely. She's tired. And you're all she has left. There was silence after that, just a few seconds, but it was louder than anything I'd ever heard. Because there it was. Proof. Concrete. Undeniable. They weren't guessing how to help me. They were strategizing how to manipulate me, like I was some wounded bird too dazed to notice the cage closing in. It wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. It was a plan. It was tactical. And they had the audacity to call it family. The next day, I started digging deeper. I checked every drawer, every closet, every damn cabinet in this house. I tore through rooms like a woman possessed, because I knew there had to be more. And when I opened the guest room closet, tucked behind a stack of old blankets, I found it, another gift box, smaller than the first, wrapped in red satin ribbon, sitting there like it was waiting to be discovered. Inside was a set of lingerie, black lace, expensive, my size. Alongside it was another note, folded delicately like a love letter. Soon, you'll be mine. Let him go. I didn't even flinch this time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just laughed, low, bitter, hollow. Because now I knew. This wasn't obsession anymore. This was declaration. This was Dean carving his name into my life like he already owned it. And I realized something then, something sharp and cold and empowering. I wasn't crazy. They were just twisted. And if they wanted to play a game, then fine, I'd play. But I'd play better. Smarter. Meaner. So I started acting different. Softer. More agreeable. I let Dean get closer. I let Margaret believe I was starting to see things their way. I smiled more. I invited Dean in for dinner. I let him brush against me without pulling away. I started planting ideas in their heads, little breadcrumbs of false hope, leading them straight into the trap I was building. I told Margaret she might have been right about God's plan. I told Dean I wasn't sure how long I could keep waiting for Ryan to wake up. I told them just enough to keep them leaning in, just enough to make them drop their guard. Because what they didn't know was that I'd already sent the audio files to my friend Amanda, a lawyer who owed me a favor. They didn't know I'd already made copies of the lingerie note, of the insurance policy, of every message Dean had sent me. They didn't know I was recording every dinner, every visit, every word. They didn't know I was playing a longer game, and I had every intention of flipping the script in a way they wouldn't see coming until it hit them like a brick wall. Let them think I was breaking. Let them think I was giving in. Because the truth was, I was done waiting to be rescued. I was going to burn this from the inside out, and they were going to watch it happen, one slow, painful step at a time. It's a strange kind of calm that settles over you when you finally decided to stop surviving and start striking back. It's not loud or frantic or even satisfying in the way people think revenge should feel. It's cold, methodical, deliberate. It's the kind of calm that comes after weeks of walking on glass and smiling through clenched teeth while your skin crawls and your instincts scream that you're one step away from losing your grip entirely. But now, with the evidence in hand and the plan unfolding like a well-written script, I didn't feel like prey anymore. I felt like the storm they never saw coming. Dean, of course, thought he was winning. He thought the slow smile I gave him over dinner meant surrender. He thought the gentle nods and softer tone in my voice meant I was warming to the idea of replacing my husband with him. And Margaret? She was practically humming with smug satisfaction, dropping little hints about fresh starts and God's will, like she was the conductor of some grand spiritual orchestra, blissfully unaware that the sheet music had changed. What they didn't realize was that every word, every sigh, every subtle manipulation was being recorded, cataloged, and prepared for the one move they hadn't expected: public exposure. The final piece of the trap came together on a Thursday night, and I couldn't have asked for a more perfect setup. I invited Dean over for drinks, told him I'd been thinking about everything he'd said, played the part of a woman caught between guilt and longing, fragile and malleable. He showed up with wine and that same fake tenderness he always wore like cheap cologne, confident that the finish line was in sight. I led him into the living room, poured his drink, and let the evening unfold exactly how he wanted, only every second of it was being caught on a hidden camera tucked inside the bookshelf, perfectly angled to capture his every word, every touch, every sick little confession. It didn't take long. Half a bottle in and Dean's tongue started to loosen. He leaned in close, whispered things he probably thought were romantic, things that made my skin crawl, but I let them slide because I needed him to say the words out loud. When I asked him gently why he hadn't said anything sooner, why he'd waited until now to come forward, his face shifted, pride swelling in his expression like a man claiming a prize he believed was already his. Because I couldn't, he slurred, hand brushing my knee. Not while he was still around. But now it's different. You see it, don't you? You feel it. I asked him if Margaret knew, if she'd encouraged him, and his answer came too quickly, too easily, as if he'd been waiting for me to bring it up. She understands, he said, eyes dark with certainty. She said you needed someone strong. Someone already part of the family. Someone who could handle the future. That was all I needed. I excused myself to the kitchen, pretending I needed to clear my head, and stepped out just long enough to save the footage to 3 separate drives, one I hid at home, one I dropped off with Amanda that same night, and one I sent directly to the hospital's patient liaison with a detailed, anonymous message about manipulation, coercion, and mental instability. I didn't wait for the fallout. I didn't want to be in the house when it finally imploded. 2 days later, it happened. Dean was arrested on hospital grounds after he showed up uninvited again, this time trying to sneak into Ryan's room under the pretense of checking on him. They found multiple texts, voicemails, and video evidence backing up the claims I'd already submitted. Margaret tried to contain it, tried to cry her way through the scandal, claimed misunderstanding, insisted her son had simply been misunderstood, mentally fragile from grief, a victim of circumstance. But the footage said otherwise. The footage said everything I needed it to say. And then, in a twist I hadn't even planned for, Ryan woke up. Just like that. As if his body had been waiting for the chaos to reach a peak before pulling him back into the mess. I stood there at his bedside, watching his eyes flicker open for the first time in weeks, my heart clenched so tight I thought it might split open. He looked at me like he was trying to remember who I was, what year it was, what life we were supposed to be living. And when the doctors told me he had no memory of the accident, or anything that came before it, I just nodded and thanked them. When he saw Dean being led away in handcuffs and his mother sobbing uncontrollably in the corner, he looked to me, eyes wide with confusion, lips trembling with the start of a question he didn't even know how to ask. I just smiled gently, leaned close to him, and said, "There's a lot to catch you up on, babe." And maybe that should have been the end of it, the perfect moment of justice, the grand finale where the villain is dragged off stage and the hero walks away with peace. But life doesn't work like that, not really. Life leaves you with cracks, with echoes, with questions you'll never get full answers to. Later that night, after the noise had settled and Ryan was resting again, he turned his head toward me in the dim hospital light and whispered something so soft I almost didn't hear it. "You know, I always knew Dean was in love with you." I didn't respond. I just stared at him, my face unreadable, my thoughts louder than anything I could have said out loud. Because maybe he did know. Maybe deep down he saw the signs before I ever did. Maybe he just didn't want to believe it either. Or maybe that was his way of telling me he remembered more than he let on. Maybe it was a test. But I didn't say a word. I let the silence answer for me. And maybe that silence said everything he needed to hear. Or maybe, just maybe, I let the rest burn quietly in the background, exactly the way it was always meant to.